All right. Hello, my friend. This is Generous Theology, and this is Brock. I'm here with my good friend, Chuck.
Hi, Brock.
Great to be talking with you, my friend. We have a chance tonight to get into some Herman Bavinck. We have been looking recently in his Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 3. And we are on a section talking about dogma and theology in the West. And this section opens, we're at pericope 42, for those of us following along in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, in the contrast between East and West. And I think the last time we spoke, Chuck, we got into a lot of detail about the Eastern Mediterranean. We talked about its amazing influence in the early centuries of Christianity. Of course, not just those early centuries. The Christian East remains influential even to today, but there was something really special. There was a particularly important role that Greek-speaking English Eastern Mediterranean civilization played. And I'm thinking here of the cities of influence in terms of Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem. We talked about how that passed away as the Romans had shut down the city, and in the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Jewish diaspora that came about because of that. And so really how in those centuries, the East was so crucial and so important. Now, as those centuries, the first 2 or 3 centuries start to come to a close, that period comes to a close, we have the emergence of a new culture, a profoundly Christian culture in the West. And this is the start of what we now today call the Latin culture. And the birth of it is really exciting. And I was really excited to read that in Bavinck's portrayal here of the Latin West, how that part of Christianity bootstrapped and started to become very influential and also pull the center of gravity in the Christian world to the West, toward places Rome, toward other places as well, too. We're going to talk about North Africa and the really amazing, almost oversized influence that North Africa had on the early Latin culture, and in particular, one North African. And this is just really exciting. Now, unlike the Greek-speaking Mediterranean East, at the risk of overly reducing, the West was really a different culture, a cultural ethos. It was, of course, the center of the Western Roman Empire and the Roman Empire for a time up until the division. But then we're going to see East and West in Christian thought really develop into not their own differing faiths, but how the Christian East and the Christian West are going to end up having a different flavor to them. And so Bavinck's talking here about the contrast. And when you think about it, Chuck, what are some of the things that were really striking to you about the differences between the East and West as you read this section?
Yeah, one thing right at the very beginning, Bavinck makes some statements that are interesting to me. I think it may be worth thinking a little further about what he's saying and what it exactly means. But for example, he focuses on how in the East, the dominant theme in dogmatics was that humanity was subjected by sin to corruption, and in Christ is now liberated from death, made partakers of life, immortality, the divine nature. And then in the West, the human relationship to God is what's stressed. This relationship is that of a guilty being before a just God whose commandments he's violated, but Christ, by his work, obtained the grace of God, the forgiveness of sins, the power to obey the law, and this pushes a person to live an active life towards obedience and submission. Now, I can't totally disagree with that might be a focus. I think we have to be a little bit careful not to say that the focus means that that's all we think about, because I think that first part, that dominant theme in Eastern dogmatics of sin and corruption, I think to some extent, and maybe Bavinck will talk about this later on, but to some extent, maybe in the Reformation, we recaptured some of that, perhaps not in quite the same way that Eastern Orthodoxy still today stresses it, but it does seem like that perhaps losing some of that focus in the East led to some of the excesses of the West, which the Reformation dealt with. There's another piece here, too, that was just really interesting to me. Bavinck says that this focus on the subjection by sin to corruption and Christ as the liberator from death. He says, in the foreground of this are the ideas of substance, essence, nature. Okay, that makes sense. Ideas that foster stagnation and quiescence in doctrine as in life. It's interesting. I want to think more about that and think about what he might mean by that. And I think I have some idea of that. And then he says, as far as the West, then that focus on the grace of God obtained through Christ for people pushes a person to live an active life toward obedience and submission. And so there's this action, this activity, rather than stagnation and quiescence. Now, again, I think if we push things too far, we can say, well, you go all the way into action and it all becomes about action and it's all based on the focus on the human relationship to God. Maybe that's a little bit, again, where the West maybe has taken that a step too far, not at the time of the Reformation, but even later in the focus on individualism, on the 19th century focus as humanity as the center of all existence. And maybe there's a sense that you can say that activity also leads to some of these ideas of whether early it's Pelagianism, later on it's Arminianism, and that needed to be fought against. On the other side, of course, this idea of stagnation and quiescence, there is a sense that, at least when you look at the history of the East, that the East hasn't been quite as active. It's not that they were inactive, but it hasn't been quite as active in missionary work, and the way that the gospel spread from the East has been very different. I think world Christianity, whether that's in the world of the South, Africa and Latin America and Asia, is much more affected by Western Christianity than Eastern Christianity, and I think there is a reason for that. But there is also a sense in which some level of quiescence, some level of focus on substance and nature and essence is also important, that we don't lose all of that. And later, as Bavinck gets into Augustine, he doesn't really spend a lot more time focusing on just that difference. But it is interesting to me, because I think in reading it, at first I was like, oh, is he taking this further than I think he ought to go with it? On the other hand, I think we also have to recognize that some of the issues that might lead one to say, perhaps the West went too far, were just beginning to make themselves known when Bavinck is writing this. Certainly Bavinck later had to deal with some of those issues, and did into the 20th century. But it is interesting the way that he's written this in contrasting the East and the West, a contrast that I think that he makes that has some reality to it, that has some teeth to it, but also I think we want to make sure that as we read it, we remember that what Bavinck is not doing here is saying, let's pick all the one and not the other, but is really more contrasting ideas and showing where it went. Whereas I think Bavinck would probably agree that our dogmas need to have both, right? We need to have a focus on the work of Christ for sinners, but we also do have to have a focus on the work of Christ as a liberator from death and making us partakers of life, and the fact that we're subjected to sin and corruption in all we do, just as the Eastern focus was, according to Bavinck. So it was a very interesting section, and one that led me to think quite a bit. I remember the first time I read it, thinking through that, and then coming back to it again in the last couple of weeks and reading it over a few times too, and just sort of thinking through what is Bavinck saying here, and what does it mean and what does it not mean was just really interesting to me. And I'm interested in your take on that as well, because I wonder if you had similar reactions as I did.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. I loved that layout. I think that, so first of all, I was struck by Bavinck's assessment, as you were. And I think the thing that struck me was that this was an insight that my ears needed to hear. Let me explain. I would say that of the two sides, we could call them, for lack of a better term, we could call them a conservative side. We could call them a progressive side. And I would definitely place myself much more on the conservative side in terms of life issues overall, not merely politics, but in general. I think there's something, I think my default preference in life is to seek timeless truths. And usually you find those timeless truths by studying the past, by taking a look to history to see what the best thinkers of the past who have already had to grapple with the issue for hundreds of years had come up with. And so that puts me very much on the conservative side over and against the progressive side. Now, in neither of these would I say we're speaking about an absolute. So there are things that I would embrace on the progressive side of life, and eschew, for lack of a better word, on the conservative side. But so I was struck when Bavinck said this in the foreground. Now he's speaking about the Mediterranean East here, our ideas of substance, essence, nature. And as you continued the quote, ideas that foster stagnation and quiescence in doctrine as in life. Now, it struck me because Bavinck is pointing his bony finger at my conservatism. And I was really forced to agree with him. For there is a decidedly stagnating force that underlies conservatism. If we're simply just trying to rediscover timeless truths, Chuck, then we're spending less time innovating and more time continuing in a status quo, for lack of a better word here. And I thought about some of the religious wars that I have had a chance to participate in over the 20 years that I have been Reformed. And over again, Chuck, there's this idea that many conservatives trot out these concepts that came from the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, particularly movements that we today call classical theism. And as conservative as I am, Chuck, I've had very bad heartburn speaking with classical theists, not because they're not brothers in the faith, not because they don't respect the doctrines they're fighting for, but because in some sense, one of two things tended to happen over and over again. First of all, they wanted to refight the battles of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. Now, that's commendable if one wants to have a good, solid grounding in doctrine, conservatively speaking. But at the same point in time, classical theists are still fighting the battles that were decided in this time period 1,500 or more years ago. And worse, I saw a lot of my classical theist friends turn these battles into tribalistic purity wars. If you don't agree with exactly their terminology, if you don't hold to exactly the view of divine impassibility that they hold to, if you're not a classical theist, you're not Reformed, is what several people have said to me. And Chuck, what a big bother. What a big waste. What a big nothing burger to say it in a crude and crass way. And so when I read this sentence from Bavinck, at first it hurt because it seemed critically directed at me. But then at second point, I think I see what he's talking about. And so I'm not throwing out conservatism. I think that's still my main approach, but I think I want to be careful. I think we conservatives can find it all too easy to fall into pitfalls of our own kind. So, Chuck, we may be great at pointing out the foibles, the faults, the tendencies of progressives, and there are many, but lo and behold, we can have those. We can have foibles and faults of our own as conservatives, Chuck, even if they're not the same kinds of faults that progressives might be subject to. And so I was really struck by that. There was another interesting part here that was interesting to me. He says, in the East, the mystical, liturgical element predominates, but in the West, the juridical, political element. And wow, is that insightful. That really does help. I think personalities who are, and again, I'm speaking in generalities here, but I think personalities who are excited by the timelessness of things like the law are going to find in the Western tradition what Bavinck calls this juridical political element that kind of personality seems to thrive upon. While people who see things in a much more ambiguous and in a much more gray and less binary sense are going to maybe be pulled toward the mystical liturgical elements. Now, I would say in the centuries since, it's nowhere near fair to say, nor does Bavinck say it, that the West is all one way and the East is all the other way. But having said that, there's enough of a tendency there that there really is the East is from Mars and the West is from Venus. And I really respected Bavinck for saying that. And Chuck, as much as I want to, if I could have one gift for Christmas, it would be the world living much more conservatively, as I define it, in a generous and noble sense. But having read Bavinck here, what if the answer might be something like, we need the progressive side to be more conservative, but maybe we need the conservative side to be more progressive? Now, I realize that's problematic because it's ambiguous, but at the very least, that struck me. So that's an opening there, Chuck. And there was one other quote I wanted your take on, so I'm going to throw it right over to you. It said this. It said, in the East, people resonate especially to the Apostle John. And in the West, people resonate to Paul. And I said, I've got to ask Chuck what he thinks that means and how he reacted to that particular sentence.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And I think it fits in with what we've been talking about in using small c conservatism and small p progressivism to describe a little bit the difference between the West and the East, or the East and the West. When I think of traditional conservatism, I think of people like Edmund Burke and the focus on society and the community as opposed to strict individualism. And there is a sense in which that in the East, and a little more focus on the individual in the West, something more like traditional liberalism as opposed to what we sometimes use those terms to mean in U.S. politics today. And it's interesting because I think you see that even in that quote as well. And I think of some of the battles that have gone on in more recent years. And there does at times seem to be among some who are more, maybe we would say, progressive in the mainline community, moving away from Paul, concerned about Paul, or concerned about an over focus on Paul. We see, I think, in some of that a move back towards the Gospels and John in particular. There's been a lot of discussion about how we need to have a fourth year of the lectionary because the 3 years of the lectionary focused on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John is only just spread out through there, and maybe we should have a year on John. And it's interesting how that conversation sort of fits into all of this. And then it flips itself on its head a little bit, right? Because in some ways, what's happening is that in the most progressive institutions, there's almost a recoiling from the excesses of that and a move back into, in some ways, small c conservatism. And in the same way that there may be on the more conservative side a sense that, hey, we need to move more, we need to progress a little bit more. Maybe the Eastern Christianity needs to focus more on doing some things that are more action-oriented. And I think your comment was that maybe we need a little bit of both, and we need each side to pick up a little bit of that. And I think there is some to that. And I think we're maybe even seeing that. I wonder what Bavinck would say if he were alive today, or even 10, 15 years ago, when it seemed there was a large movement among younger folks out of evangelicalism and into Eastern Orthodoxy, especially Eastern Orthodoxy. And I think that's slowed down a little, but it hasn't completely ended. I'm still seeing younger folks drawn towards Orthodoxy. And why is that? Well, it seems like there's almost a sense in which the Western focus on the individual, which is proper, what Bavinck talks about, the Western church focusing on the human relationship to God as a guilty being before a just God whose command is violated, that's important. But if we make that the be-all and end-all, do we lose something of what the East had in understanding that humanity is subjected by sin to corruption? And so I almost wonder whether Bavinck might say, aha, do you remember what I wrote in paragraph 42 of my first volume of Reformed Dogmatics? And I wasn't saying that one side was good and the other side was bad. What I was saying is that the Eastern side could lead to certain problems. The Western side could also lead to certain problems. And what you have here is people recognizing that and trying to pull it back. Now, I don't know how much Bavinck would have used that kind of language. Is there somewhat of a dialectic going on? That might be a dirty word for some people to hear Bavinck using, and I don't think he uses that kind of terminology very often. But I almost wonder whether he might have, if he were alive today, he might say, this is what I was talking about, and how you can pull too far to one side. And sometimes you need both of those sides to pull back a little bit and pick up on those things. And so you in the West, us in the West, maybe we do need to think a little bit more about custom and convention and tradition in the way that the Eastern Church did it without being overcome by quiescence and inaction. And you in the East, you folks need to pick it up a little. You need to do a little more. You need to focus a little more on some of these things that cause us to go into action. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly what he would say. Certainly, Bavinck was a product of the West in many ways, but I also think that there is, as we and as we'll see, I think as we get into First Roman Catholic theology and then the Reformation and some things from that, I think there is at some point there are some of these balances happening over time, and so the fact that maybe we're seeing a little bit of this push and pull today is just really just another piece of that. It's not all that different than the Reformation or other times where there was a push and pull in various directions. And in fact, Bavinck himself talks about that even in this late ancient era, where he talks about, and we'll get to this a little bit, where he talks about Augustine and Augustine's legacy and how there were those even in the West who opposed a lot of what Augustine was saying and tried to go against it. There were others who followed it, some of whom followed it in ways that maybe led to some issues. He talks about Pope Gregory the Great being certainly someone who followed in the footsteps of Augustine, but then in many ways took those things to a level where Augustine never would have wanted them to go. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Well said, Chuck. Well said. In this section, Bavinck does something beautiful. Now, a professor spoke to me about history being made up, history being written by historians. And he talked about historians as generally falling into doing one of two kinds of tasks. And he called them lumpers and splitters. Now, the idea being is that there were some historians that wrote their works with the idea of lumping things together. And so how do you understand the emerging Latin West? That's a kind of a lumper question. What do? You go through and you pick all the disparate elements of the Latin West and you try to find the themes that organize them. And then you have a different kind of historian, or even the same historian writing about something different. And here he wants to focus on one thing and split it into its many parts. So think of somebody saying, well, why did the Roman Empire fall? Well, okay, here perhaps a historian is less likely to be a lumper and more likely to start with a big thing. In this case, for example, the Roman Empire. And then what does the historian do? He starts to split. Okay, what caused the Roman Empire to fall? He'll split it maybe into 3 to 5 main themes. Well, this happened, and then the empire had to face this, and then there were enemies over there, and then there were economic situations over here. And so these lumpers and splitters really do give some insight into the way we understand history. Now, what Bavinck does here is a combination of lumping and splitting, which I think is the best kind of historical combination. Well, in the latter half of this pericope, Bavinck lists a good list. I don't know, Chuck, what is it, 15, maybe 20 different theologians. And I'm just going to read some names. So he's talking about these important theologians in the East and in the West, but the Eastern theologians for impacting the West. He's talking about theologians like Marius Victorinus, Hilary of Poitiers, Ambrose, Jerome, Enos, Marius Mercator, John Cassian, Ambrose, Clement, Origen, Didymus, Basil, of course, Augustine, but Eusebius, Gregory of Nazianzus, Philo, now Pontius Jovinian, Helvidius. Now, having given a fair accounting for the diversity of theological thought, he then creates a funnel, and I like this funnel. He then says that all of what these theologians do seems to funnel through two big names. Now, it's not fair to lump all of these theologians into just two categories. But Chuck, you and I have talked about this before. We ask somebody, hey, who do you think are the top three presidents of the United States of all time? Chuck, by definition, if you're going from 45 down to 3, you're going to have to simplify. And so that's what it is here too. And Bavinck makes a compelling case that the Latin West funnels in an extremely important way through two theologians, Jerome and Augustine. Now, why Jerome? There's an easy one-word answer there, and that is the Vulgate. Now, the Vulgate is the Latin translation that was produced by Jerome, and variations of that Vulgate remained standard biblical corpus throughout the Christian West for what, Chuck, 1,200, 1,300 years. And so the Christian West is really reading from this relatively organized corpus, and that the impact of that is hard to overstate. And then on the theological and doctrinal side, it used to be said in antiquity, all roads lead to Rome. Now, borrowing that here, I think we can say, with some risk of oversimplifying, we can say that all roads in theology from antiquity lead through Augustine. Now, this doesn't mean that he articulated all positions. This doesn't mean that he believed everything, but he, in some sense, is a North Star for this emerging Latin culture. And his influence is defined around where people measure up to or fit relative to him for over 1,000 years. Now, it's hard to overstate this important. John Calvin, when he's writing his Institutes of the Christian Religion in the 16th century, so this is roughly 1,200 years after Augustine, and still in Calvin's Institutes, he is quoting Augustine more than any other theologian. And you and I have talked before. Musicians today revere Johann Sebastian Bach, and Bach only lived 300-400 years ago. And still, musicians consistently rank him the greatest composer, musician of all time. And so we have that, very much of that happening here with Augustine. And that's why Bavinck is going to break out in Pericope 43 in this East and West meet in Augustine. Now, there's a lot to say about Augustine, Chuck. And so I'm just going to throw it over to you to just start with some of what you thought were the main points that really arise related to him.
Yeah, you're right that Bavinck talks about the entire dogmatic development in the East and in the West, culminating in Augustine. And he focuses a little bit. He says, you look at the doctrine of the Trinity. You look at issues around Christology, and a lot of that really is from the Eastern tradition, and he took that in and then expressed that in a lot of his writing. You've got the doctrine of humanity and sin and grace and faith and satisfaction and merit that he gets from Tertullian and Ambrose, and talks about Neoplatonism from Victorinus and Cyprian's doctrine of the church and sacrament and the monastic ideal of Jerome and Hilary. This is all absorbed and then appropriated and comes out in Augustine's writing. I think another thing, though, that's important, and this ties back a little bit to the fact that Augustine is firmly in the tradition of the West, is that Augustine's firm point of departure is still the human being. And he does that, according to Bavinck, because as you consider the human being, as you consider self-consciousness, the yearning that humans have for truth and the need for truth and for happiness and for goodness, which Bavinck says all together really are one and the same thing, truth, happiness, and goodness, that this makes some sense, because by doing it that way, you have a certain and reliable starting point. Because even doubt, and we've talked about this in the past in some of our discussions of philosophy, even doubt itself in some ways assumes that there must be truth, there must be reality, right? If you're doubting something, there has to be something to doubt. And there has to be, if you doubt that something is true, there must be an alternative reality. It's not that all truths are one and the same and can all coexist at the same time. And I think this does reflect a little bit on Bavinck's discussion earlier on how the West, he saw the West as really beginning that focus, having that beginning focus on the human relationship to God. It's not that by making the human being the point of departure isn't saying we're ignoring God, not at all. Augustine is doing is saying, okay, here we are as humans. Who are we and how do we relate to this God? Augustine often talks about ideas of sin and what that means, but he does not merely from just this idea that God has determined that this is what's normative and anything else is corrupt. But Augustine really begins by talking about, I, as a human, am a sinful person. I have these sinful desires. I go and steal pears from my neighbor or whatever. And that's where he begins it. And that, I think that is firmly in the Western tradition. And yet he does bring in a lot of these Eastern thinkers, a lot of these Eastern theologians, and brings them into, appropriates them, is the word that Bavinck used, that I think is actually a very, very good word. He appropriates all of this massive information, brings it into himself, and then expresses it in a particular Augustinian way. And as you point out, Bavinck goes on for quite a while about how key a lot of these ideas that Augustine has are so key to the way so much of the Western Church today thinks. The Roman Catholic Church considers Augustine a saint. Protestants, as you mentioned, and John Calvin quoted Augustine more than anybody else. And still today, Protestants spend a lot of time studying and thinking about Augustine and reading his original works. And so here we've got somebody who just has had such a huge impact. He, as Bavinck says, Augustine became a theologian of the greatest importance for later dogmatics, one who dominated the following centuries. Every Reformation returns to him and to Paul. For every dogma, he found a formula that was taken over and repeated by everyone else. His influence extends to all churches, schools of theology, and sects. Rome appeals to him for its doctrine of the church, the sacrament, and the authority, while the Reformation felt kinship with him in the doctrine of predestination and grace. Scholasticism, in constructing its conceptual framework, took advantage of his sharp observation, the acuteness of his intellect, the power of his speculation. Thomas, in fact, was called the best interpreter of St. Augustine. And mysticism, in turn, found inspiration in his Neoplatonism and in his religious enthusiasm. Both Catholic and Protestant piety buoy themselves up on his writings. Asceticism and pietism find nourishment and support in his work. And so Augustine, therefore, does not belong to one church, but belongs to all churches together. He is the universal teacher, the Doctor Universalis. Wow, those are big words.
Amen. Oh, big words for a theologian of a big influence. And Chuck, I'm with you on that. Now, there are some really interesting things to talk about Augustine, and you can make a career. One can make a career, I apologize, for just the study of his own works. They are that numerous, they're that plentiful, and they are that controversial today. I'm not talking about controversial in his day alone. I'm talking about Augustine is the center of focus for controversy today, and I want to talk specifically about that. But first, let's just state a few things up front. Bavinck points out what needs to be pointed out. Augustine, as Bavinck says, did not produce a theological dogmatic system. So Augustine is not creating an interlocking set of doctrines that are intending to model and summarize and systematize the Christian faith. Augustine is all over the map in the sense that he has his hands in almost every topic of importance, and not with a mind towards systematically unifying them. And what do I mean by that? Well, that deserves some explanation, because Bavinck here talks about Augustine striving so hard to arrive at unity. What does that mean if not systematic? Well, it depends on what we think system means. And I think maybe throwing out some ideas, think about analytic ideas of system today and think about some of the sciences. So some of the exactness, some of the precision that we want to have in theology has to be considered in light of what we're trying to say. What does that mean? Well, I'm very concerned about movements that want to mandate that we can only speak about certain doctrines by using a particular lexicon. You can only use this Greek word, Chuck, when you're talking about this aspect of God. You can only mean one thing, for example, in classical theism. You can only mean one thing when you're talking about God's simplicity and God's impassibility. As we have found out in the last 15 or 20 years, it's not quite as simple as that. And so Augustine didn't want to solve all of those problems necessarily, but he did want to move the ball forward. Let's maybe put it that way. Now, there's an interesting aspect of Augustine that actually makes me want to, in a tongue-in-cheek sense, speak of Augustine as the first modern. Now, this is going to be controversial, Chuck, and I'm not making an academic or scholarly defense of a thesis. But as you and I talked about in his Confessions, Augustine speaks about this inner landscape, this inner subjectivity of the human that brings out this longing for God, this need. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, meaning God. And so Augustine is this quintessential, one of the first seminal thinkers talking about this inner landscape and how the inner landscape of the subjective human life drives theology. Now, does that mean theology is not objective, doesn't have that eternal, immutable, objective aspect to it? Of course not. But what it means is Augustine spoke in a way that was quite rare. He spoke very autobiographically in his Confessions. That was a little bit unusual for writings of the time. And he also spoke with that ability to look inside of himself. Now, how does this make him one of the first moderns? Well, what is the Enlightenment, Chuck, if not a rediscovery of Augustine's idea, what Bavinck calls here Augustine's firm point of departure, the human being, his self-conscious, his yearning and need for truth, his happiness and his goodness. Now, self-consciousness, Bavinck says of Augustine, is the final ground of truth. There is an argument to be made that the Enlightenment, especially in its modern and secular forms, is a rediscovery of Augustine without the God that Augustine found. So we read, you and I, Chuck, on another episode, we talked about from Augustine's Confessions, how he looks within himself. And what does he find? Well, he doesn't just find a what? He doesn't just find his own subjective inner truth, but he finds a who is there with him. And now who is that who? It is God. And so Augustine looks inward and finds self and God. The modern, especially on the secular side, looks within, does not find God. What an interesting development. It's almost as if those secularizing forces of modernity are simply an apostate form of Augustinianism. Now, of course, that's oversimplified, but it's a good start. One thing, listen to some statements like this and how close to phenomenological they sound. Bavinck says of Augustine, eternal, immutable truth can only be found by the activity of the mind. The sensible is not the truth, but only an image of it. As a rule, Augustine looked for the way to truth, not outside of ourselves through nature, but through the activity of the human spirit. There, in reason, his own and that of everyone, he finds eternal, immutable truths that refer back to and converge in God. This knowledge of self and the knowledge of God are the two poles between which all human thought oscillate. Chuck, that's Calvin's Sensus Divinitatus from the opening of Calvin's Institutes. We find it right here in Augustine. Wow, how seminal, how foundational this is. And I really appreciated that Augustine brought that out. Now, somebody's going to be tempted to think, wow, Brock and Chuck, you must be arguing that Augustine was a Calvinist. Well, no, we're not arguing that. But if he's not a Calvinist, he's laying the groundwork. He's placing the materials. Let me think of this and let me try this analogy. He is David to Calvin's Solomon, if you want to look at the institutes as a form of Solomon's temple. So to use the analogy, David does not construct the temple, he prepares it so that his son can. And in the same way, Augustine does not build what becomes Reformed theology ultimately, but rather he prepares it. He lays the groundwork, and then later folks like Calvin come along and do the quote unquote systematization. Now, Chuck, I've been acting like a lumper here. It's not all that easy, but I think this form of lumping at least gives us a marketable starting point in the discussion. Let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I like that. I like your analysis, and especially I really resonated with your analysis that Augustine, in focusing on the human soul and on the human soul's longing, and in diving into himself, looking for something, he found God, which is different. That's the difference here, right? That the 19th century moderns dived into themselves and they didn't find God. All they found was more of themselves, and in many cases that was pretty scary. and so yeah, I like that analysis. And then of course it's probably true that Augustine wasn't a Calvinist, but it's certainly true that Calvin was an Augustinian. That's for sure. And it's the thing that I think, as you pointed out, as Augustine went into himself, as he searched himself, he found God. And Bavinck talks about that a little bit too. He says that Augustine, sure, he attempted to prove from nature and especially from human nature, not only the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but also the Trinity. But for him, God is not abstract, an unqualified being, but rather the living one, the supreme truth, the highest good, the greatest bliss, and therefore the only being fully able to satisfy the human heart. And that's the piece that these moderns missed, is in looking into themselves, they were looking for that ultimate bliss, that greatest bliss, that one thing that is fully able to satisfy the human heart, and they totally missed God. They went right past it, because many of them knew they had the ability to understand theology that was around them, but they went right past it and kept going deeper in, trying to find it in themselves, trying to find their greatest bliss and the thing most able to satisfy the human heart in humanity itself. And that's what they really missed. And Augustine, praise God, didn't miss it. And so that's a really important piece. And in understanding that, yeah, sure, some of those 19th century folks might have built on some of the things Augustine said, but they did so missing the most important building block. Fortunately for us, Calvin didn't miss that. And so we still have, even within our Reformation legacy, we still have that legacy of Augustine as well. And Augustine's legacy is an important one. It's one that still has a huge impact all around the world and all sorts of Christian traditions. It's fitting and proper that Bavinck spent as much time talking about Augustine as he did.
Now, there's one lagging issue here that I hope to bring up and maybe not fully resolve in our discussion because we're pushing our time limit, but it almost has to be said at the risk of missing something major. And that is this idea that Augustine today is an extremely controversial figure. And to put it in the language common to our day, Chuck, I would say that Augustine has been canceled by large parts of Christianity. Let me explain that to a degree. You and I have talked in great detail about the anti-dogmatism of the critics of Christianity from the idealistic movement of the 19th century. Think here, Kant, Schleiermacher, Hegel, and how dogma became a dirty word. And one of the other things that became, quote unquote, dirty during this time period was the attack by Christian critics against hagiographic forms of writing. And what does that mean, Chuck? So let's say I'm writing your biography. And you come to me, you give me a lot of great notes about yourself. And so I write this biography. Chuck went to this college, and when he walked down the sidewalk, tulips sprang out behind him because he was so wonderful. He went into classrooms, and young ladies swooned, and teachers just teachers wanted to speak with him, and provosts and presidents everywhere just were hoping to get his autograph. That would be an example of a hagiographic biography. By the way, it might be true, Chuck, because you are pretty awesome. But just on the off chance here, the critics of Christianity were saying in this 19th century, in this modern secular enlightenment, the critics were saying we cannot trust Christian writings about the past, in part because they are so hagiographic that as to be disqualified, as to be unusably partisan, as to be unreliable and untrustworthy as sources for information. And so, within that same vein, within that same criticism, the heroes, quote unquote, of traditional Christianity during that time period were often denigrated for reasons that I shall call, basically, I believe they invented, I shouldn't say invented, they maybe perfected in that context an anti-hagiographic genre of writings. And so we still see that today, Chuck. We see, for example, the emergence of atheistic scholarship in the Christian world. Well, I've had more than one non-believing friend read, for example, Dr. Bart Ehrman. Well, I'm going to read what Dr. Ehrman says about the Bible because I can trust him. I can't trust those Christians when they're talking about it because they just want to sell me their faith. And so we see that sort of thing where the writings of an atheist have a presumed validity over the writings of a presumably partisan Christian. And so what has happened is the 12 to 1300 years of influence. Remember, we were talking about Augustine having this amazing influence, which certainly, by the way, included its hagiographic aspect. Well, now Augustine has largely been canceled. And the way he's been canceled is the way so many other figures, classical figures, have been canceled in recent decades. What do we think about George Washington? He's canceled. What do we think about Thomas Jefferson? He's canceled. What do we think about Shakespeare? He's been canceled. All of these things. And the portrayals, scholarly portrayals of Augustine of our generation, our lifetime, range from the moderately hagiographic, to use their terminology, to the neutral, where the neutral would be those who are critical of Augustine, would be writing neutral scholarship about him. But then we see that if Christians can be hagiographic, well, skeptics can be just as harmfully tribalistic in their anti-hagiographies. And so, for example, I think it's one of the Augustine interpreters of our generation, Brown, his first name is escaping me, is just dismissed in this companion book that I'm reading on Augustine. He's dismissed as being too easy on Augustine and too light on the faux pas and the bad things that Augustine did. And then these scholars writing neutral works about Augustine seem to be doing something that's a little bit more than writing neutral scholarship about Augustine. They seem to be taking the events of Augustine's life into an anti-hagiographic setting. So if under some writers Augustine can do no wrong, under these critics' pen, Augustine can do no right. And if it's helpful, I don't have it prepared tonight, but I could go into some specifics and name some names of some of the reading that I've done along those lines. But the point is what an interesting section. Imagine the musicians of today being criticized by musicians 300 years from now for following the discredited practices of Johann Sebastian Bach, who it turns out was a hater, a colonial figurehead, who was a this, who was a that, who's not worthy of our scholarship and time. We should instead embrace this new ordering of music around these different parameters. And I think you'll have an idea of the kind of thing that's happened to Augustine in the last 50 years, if not longer. And so that's very concerning. I think that's the one paucity that I would really point out. Usually, Chuck, you and I want to find scholarship outside of our school because we benefit from it. But one of the things I'm finding is when I read critical scholarship about Augustine, I really can't tell if they're trying to be critical or if they're just simply being partisanly anti-hagiographic. And so that's just a big concern I have, Chuck. I don't know if we need to go into that in more detail or do a sidebar with it, but as hard as we traditionalists push Augustine, it seems like there are important modern schools that wish to push back in the entirely opposite way. So I'm very concerned about that. I just wanted to throw that over to you as some final thoughts.
I have seen some criticism of Augustine. Most of it has been from either folks who there is some of that hagiography or anti-hagiography out there. There's some folks who really are Pelagians, new Pelagians, and I've heard some criticism of Augustine from those folks who just don't appreciate his understanding of sin and original sin and are fighting against that. But I would say that on the whole, I still find even those who perhaps don't necessarily have an axe to grind, but also aren't necessarily coming from our particular Christian perspective, still have a lot of recognize the influence of Augustine, and so there are criticisms out there. I know I was reading a set of blog posts on assessing the influence of Augustine, and it went through some of the areas where there are some criticisms. This writer said that even many Christians often do point out that he's not particularly systematic, and Bavinck pointed that out as well. So that criticism seems to be less of Augustine and more of those who take Augustine to be systematic and try to impose something there where there's not. I know that there's been also some criticism of Augustine in the way he handled a few controversies in his era. But so I just wanted to finish out with this. Assessing the influence of Augustine. This is a summary from the Oxford History of Western Philosophy. And the writers of that book say this. They say it's arguable that Augustine is the most influential philosopher who ever lived. His authority has been felt much more broadly and for a much longer time than Aristotle's, whose role in the Middle Ages was comparatively minor until rather. As for Plato, for a long time, much of his influence was felt mainly through the writings of Augustine. For more than a millennium after his death, Augustine was an authority who simply had to be accommodated. He shaped medieval thought as no one else did. Moreover, his influence did not end in the Middle Ages. Throughout the Reformation, appeals to Augustine's authority were commonplace on all sides. His theory of illumination lives on in Malebranche and in Descartes' Light of Nature. His approach to the problem of evil and to human free will is still widely held today. His force was and is still felt not just in philosophy, but also in theology, popular religion, and political thought. And again, that's from the Oxford History of Western Philosophy. So I think, I know that there are those out there who criticize, and many of those do have certain axes to grind. But I think beyond that, I think it's still fair to say that there may be no one Christian philosopher, Christian theologian who's had a greater impact than Augustine, because he is, as Bavinck points out, he doesn't belong to any one particular. He doesn't belong to Rome. He doesn't belong to Protestantism or any of the particular ranges of Protestantism, but really belongs to all of Christianity, especially Western Christian. And when we've in the past used this image, stealing from Isaac Newton, of standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, if we're standing on the shoulders of giants, among the tallest of those giants is Augustine. So I'm glad that we had the chance to talk about him, and I think especially to talk about him through the perspective of another one of those giants, a much more recent giant, Herman Bavinck. It's great stuff to be able to do that.